Nice. Okay. An important part of hypothesis testing, type 1 and type 2 errors. Our hypothesis tests are based on incomplete information, since a sample can never give us complete information about a population. Remember, sample is just part of the whole population. We take a little piece out of that. We call that the sample. Therefore, there is always a chance that our conclusion has been made in error. There are two possible types of errors that we're looking at here. All right. The first possible error is if we conclude that the null hypothesis, our assumption, is invalid. In other words, choosing to believe that the alternative hypothesis is what we should be taking or accepting. So we conclude that the null hypothesis is invalid when the null hypothesis is really true. This is called a type 1 error. All right, so type 1 error is the same as deciding to reject the null when the null is true, incorrectly supporting the alternative hypothesis. The other possible error is if we conclude that the null hypothesis, our assumption, seems reasonable, choosing not to believe the alternative hypothesis when the null hypothesis is really false. This is called a type 2 error. All right, so type 2 error is failing to reject the false null, incorrectly not supporting the alternative hypothesis. It is important to be aware of the probability of getting each type of error. The following notation is used. Alpha. Now remember, this is our significance level, right? Is the probability of making a type 1 error, which is the same as the probability to deciding to reject the null when in fact the null is true, which is can also be interpreted as the probability to incorrectly support the alternative hypothesis. All right, so alpha, the significance level of the test, as mentioned. Other possibilities here, beta. Beta is the probability of having a type 2 error, committing a type 2 error. In other words, you're deciding to accept the null. You're deciding to accept the null when indeed the null is false. You should have went, all right, so the probability of incorrectly not supporting the alternative. All right, moving along. Now we have 1 minus beta. 1 minus beta is the same as the power of the test, all right? Is the probability of deciding to reject the null when the null is false, all right? Or the probability of correctly supporting the alternative, okay? So that's the power of the test. The significance level, alpha, is the probability that we incorrectly reject the assumption and support the alternative hypothesis. In practice, a data scientist chooses the significance level based on the severity of the consequence of incorrectly supporting the alternative. In our problems, the significance level alpha will be provided. The power of a test is the probability of correctly supporting a true alternative hypothesis. Usually we are testing if there's statistical evidence to support a claim represented by the alternative hypothesis. The power of the test often tells us how often we get it right when the claim is true. All right, ideally, we want a high power. That is, we want a high power that is as close to 1 as possible. Increasing the sample size can increase the power of the test. Examples. All right, so let's take a look at example 1. Our null hypothesis for this particular example is, I guess we've got a rock climbing example here. And our null hypothesis is Frank's rock climbing equipment is safe. What possible type 1 and type 2 errors can be made here? All right, type 1 error. Well, type 1, Frank thinks that his rock climbing equipment may not be safe, when in fact it really is safe. Or a type 2 error, Frank thinks that his rock climbing equipment may be safe when in fact it is not safe. All right. So alpha is a probability that Frank thinks his rock climbing equipment may not be safe when in fact it really is safe. And beta is a probability that Frank thinks his rock climbing equipment may be safe when it is not safe. Right? So sometimes we have to consider which error has greater consequence. All right? So notice that in this case, the error with the greater consequence is the type 2 error. If Frank thinks his rock climbing equipment is safe, he will go ahead and use it, right? But his rock climbing equipment may not be safe. Bad news. He's up there on the side of a mountain someplace. He notices maybe some of his carabiners are a little loose, aren't doing their job. Maybe some of his ropes are frayed. You never know. There's a lot that goes into rock climbing. All right, example 2. It's a Boy Genetics Lab claim to be able to increase the likelihood that a pregnancy will result in a boy being born. Statisticians want to test this claim. Suppose that the null hypothesis, H sub O, is it's a Boy Genetic Lab's the Boy Genetics Lab has no effect on gender outcome. All right. So in other words, whatever the Boy Genetics Lab does in order to increase the outcome of getting a boy, the null hypothesis is that the Boy Genetics Lab has no effect on that outcome. What possible type 1 and type 2 errors can be made here? Well, type 1 error. This results when a true null hypothesis is rejected. In the context of this scenario, we would state that we believe it is a genetics lab that genetics labs influences the gender outcome when in fact it has no effect. All right, we think that genetics lab can actually make things happen, that is, get more boys, pregnancies resulting in boys, when in fact it has no effect. The type 2 error, this results when we fail to reject a false null. In context, we would state that it's genetics labs that the genetics labs do not influence the gender outcome of a pregnancy when in fact it does. All right, so once again, we consider the consequences. The error with the greater consequence would be the type 1 error here, since couples would use the genetics labs in hopes of increasing the chances of having a boy. Okay, here's another example. Example 3. A certain experimental drug claims a cure rate of at least 75% for males with prostate cancer. Describe both the type 1 and type 2 errors in context. Which error is the more serious? Okay. Type 1 error. A cancer patient believes that the cure rate for this drug is less than 75% when when it is actually at least 75%. Or the type 2 error, a cancer patient believes that the experimental drug has at least a 75% cure rate when it has a cure rate that is less than 75%. Less than 75%. Okay. In this scenario, the type 2 error contains the more severe consequence. If a patient believes the drug works at least 75% of the time, this most likely will influence the patient's and doctor's choice about whether to use the drug as a treatment option. Example 4. Suppose in this case, the null hypothesis is the victim of an automobile accident is alive when he arrives at the emergency of a hospital. Type 1 error. The emergency crew thinks the victim is dead when in fact the victim is alive. Type 2 error. The emergency crew does not know if the victim is alive when in fact the victim is dead. All right, so alpha is the probability that the emergency crew thinks the victim is dead when in fact he is really alive, right? This is the probability of the type 1 error, alpha. Or beta is the probability that the emergency crew does not know if the victim is alive when in fact the victim is dead. This is the probability of a type 2 error. All right, so in this case, the error with the greater consequence is the type 1 error. Right? If the emergency crew thinks the victim is passed, then they probably will not treat that person. All right, so that is it for section 9.2, a rather short section. Let's see, what are we looking at here? This is the section that discusses type 1 and type 2 errors. We've seen a couple of errors. We've seen a type 1 and type 2 error. We understand that the probability of a type 1 error is equal to alpha, the significance level. The probability of a type 2 error is beta, and the power of the test is 1 minus beta. All right. So these are things we're going to use in our analysis later on, a couple sections away, in section, well, 3 sections away at this point. Anyway, that's the end of this particular video. Have a good day.